session. It's
quality
okay.
over quantity.
Everyone's tired. Yeah, quality over quantity. You're right. Exactly. Yeah, high quality. But thank you so much for coming today. My name is Sweta, Shah. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm the Global Advisor for Early Childhood Development at the Khan Foundation. And the sub-theme for this particular roundtable is looking at the preschool years. And we have three phenomenal women who are going to talk to you a little bit about their work around the preschool years. We have first Amanda Devercelli at the World Bank. She's the ECD Global Lead for the World Bank. She leads the Early Learning Partnership. Yeah, and a whole range of other things within the bank. We have Fiona Smith, who's the Director of, is it early childhood or just the
early learning?
Early learning,
yes.
Sorry, early learning at the Lego Foundation. And then we have Dr. Stephanie Jones, who I think doesn't need an introduction. She has amazing plenary where she, presented all this great stuff about stress and early years, but she's at Harvard University. So I'm going to ask the three of them to provide their perspectives a little bit on the work that they're doing and their perspectives around research, some of the gaps in research, what we should be thinking about moving forward in terms of this Schools 2030 and in particular the birth and the 5-year-old cohort, because I think the preschool years really is relevant for both birth and 5-year-old cohort. So perhaps we could start with Stephanie to provide kind of the academic perspective and then go on to policy and practice.
Okay, that sounds fine. So, just to be honest with everybody at the outset, I didn't totally prepare.
This is informal.
But I didn't make a formal thing, which maybe is better. So I thought I would talk about two things, two bodies of work that we do in my lab and with a number of other faculty at the Ed School. And I'll be brief and we can talk about all of these things more. The first is, I mentioned it yesterday toward the very end, it was on the last slide, and it's a large-scale study of 3 and 4-year-old children, their families, and their settings that we decided to launch because our perception of how the early ed and care conversation unfolds in the US at least is premised on evidence and ideas that are outdated. And we place a lot of bets on what happens to 3, 4, and 5-year-old children or the experiences in early education in the US. Our expectation is that there will be tremendous returns on those investments, and I don't think we've set up a system or that we even have the kind of evidence that would really back up those claims. And so it's almost, and I'm not sure we want this on Facebook Live, but it's almost like it's a setup, right? It's a setup for failure because we're using evidence that's outdated. We're talking about a system as if it is one way when in reality it is another way. And we are placing a huge burden on 1 year of preschool for outcomes that we can't achieve even when we talk about multiple years of regular old school. So the very idea that we would hang the future on a 4-year-old single year of early education seems insane to me. We don't do that for 3rd grade. We don't do that for 5th grade. We don't do that for any of the other years of schooling. So we decided that we needed a kind of a new body of evidence, a next generation of evidence that would at least speak to certainly the power of that early childhood year for outcomes in early childhood. And if we set up our study in the right way, we would be able to follow kids over long periods of time and say something about the accumulation of experiences over multiple years and what that is related to. So with very fortuitous gift from the Saul's Aunts Charitable Foundation to me and my colleague Noni Lasso. We launched this study, and we started with a couple of design principles that we felt filled a few gaps in the early ed research field. The first is we decided at the outset that the foundation of the study, the quality and nature of the sampling, would set it up for all kinds of things that we could possibly do in the future. So we started with a representative sample of 3 and 4 year old children, 5,000 3 and 4 year old children, drawn from across the state of Massachusetts. So convenient for us to focus just on Massachusetts. Our expectation and the reality, now that we have our sample, is that this sample of children represent the state of Massachusetts sociodemographically and are generalizable to other places with similar sociodemographic populations. We also felt it was really important, maybe even more important, to simultaneously draw a representative sample of settings. So children who are 3 and 4 years old in Massachusetts are in early ed and care in a variety of settings. Some of them are in formal early education settings that are perhaps preschools that are embedded in public school systems. Some are in sort of more traditional, either for-profit or not-profit centers. Some of them are in Head Start. And then the rest of them are in informal settings. They are in their own homes. They are in family child care provider or sort of a home-based care, licensed or unlicensed. They are in the church basement. They are with a relative. So they're in all of these other kinds of arrangements that have never been represented in research on early education. Yet these are the experiences that children are having, and they're valuable ones. It's not actually the case that every 3-year-old or every 4-year-old is going to fit in a formal early ed environment for a whole variety of reasons. So we felt it was really important to sample those settings and be sure that we were representing the right distribution of 3 and 4 year olds in those types of settings in Massachusetts. So that's what we spent the first year of our study doing. Essentially, we learned, we should have known, but we didn't. We learned that nobody knows where those kids are who are in formal care. There's no systematic, statewide data system that tracks them. We could draw our representative sample of children in licensed formal settings. That was easy. But for the rest of the kids who were in informal settings, we had to mount and implement a household survey, which meant in the end, essentially knocking on 180,000 doors and asking the question, do you have a child in this house? Is that child 3 or 4 years old as of September 1st, 2017? And what kind of care are they in? And will you participate in our study? So 180,000 households generated about 900 kids. So, and that was the right number. That's what our target was, given what we understood to be the distribution of kids across settings in the state. But it costs a tremendous amount of money. It wasn't, extra money. It was the truth of what it costs to do that kind of household survey. So, it's important to spend those resources to get the right population so that you can really say something about the real experiences of kids. And so that's where we began. We've just nearly completed our first wave of data collection with those children, families, and providers. And as I said yesterday, our approach to data collection has been quite broad. We really wanted to understand features of settings that are tied to children's growth and development over time. So we knew that we had to get into settings and do observations, not just formal settings, but all of the settings. So observe at home. And if children are splitting their time between home-based care and some other setting, we need to see both of those settings. So we do lots of observations. We are doing direct assessments. Much of what we can learn about young children's skills and competencies in a whole variety of areas is not does not come easily through a survey of a parent or even a survey of a provider. You really have to see what kids can do. So we do direct assessments, capturing early language, early literacy, early math, but also self-regulation, executive function, and a variety of other things. We're also surveying parents and providers, both about their situations, their experiences, their settings, but also their view of their children. And that is the first wave is nearly completed. Our plan is to follow 3 and 4-year-olds next year when they are 4 and 5, which will be an interesting conundrum for us, because the 3-year-olds will be 4-year-olds and some of them will be in their same old setting. We can go there. The 5-year-olds will be in school. And our intention with this study is to capture children's growth and change over time in context. So we have to capture also, again, features of that new environment, which in my view means collecting data on the other children in that setting, even if they're not in our original sample. So because classrooms are not just the teacher and that individual child, they are the composition of everybody together, and that's quite meaningful for kids' experiences. So we're planning how we're going to do that, and we will follow them forever. The way we think about the study is as a kind of Framingham heart study for early childhood. And this is a famous study that sampled very carefully, again in Massachusetts, but was a landmark study in identifying key predictors of heart disease that changed how people think about heart disease. And we're hoping that this, because of the sampling, because of the foundation we've set up, and our desire and intention to follow them for long periods of time, we hope we can address some of these enduring questions about early childhood experiences that seem to bedevil all conversations about early ed in particular. So that's one thing. I'm happy to talk about that more if anybody is interested. The other body of work that seems relevant to me is the work that we do on social emotional learning. And that work is of 2 broad types. One type for us is to define, describe, communicate to the field more transparent, precise, concise information about what characterizes the domain. There's a lot of ways of thinking about this broad domain. Some call it non-academic, non-cognitive, soft skills, life skills, character development, social emotional learning. It goes on forever. And there's lots of overlap across those ideas and the terminology that's represented in them, but there's a lot of important distinctions as well. But we are not careful in how we talk about this stuff, which leads to all kinds of problems, right? It leads us to focus on things probably in the wrong way, and to certainly measure them in the wrong way. And so what we're learning about them is totally imprecise and off base. So we have a body of work that's about trying to be clear and precise and communicate effectively about the domain. We also do a lot of intervention development, delivery, implementation, and evaluation. And in that work, we've taken an approach to it that is a little different from what I think has been standard in the field to date, which is focused on programs. So much of the actual work in early childhood and in elementary schools in the US around SEL is about programs. You can adopt a program, get your teachers trained, and then it either gets implemented or not in the setting. And sometimes when it's implemented in a way that's totally different from how it was designed. So our way of thinking about it is that programs are great and have been evaluated, and there are many great things out there, but they don't really serve the needs of everyone in the field. There needs to be a new way of thinking about social emotional learning that pushes toward integration into the fabric of how early education, how elementary education, and so on conducts itself into the fabric of schools and schooling. And our way of thinking about that is to identify, test, deliver, scale, what we call kernels of practice for SEL. And they are low burden, less intensive, strategy-based practices that come out of programs, but represent their kind of common elements. We've just started a project with funding from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to look across 25 evidence-based SEL programs, identify their common elements, build them as strategies, and test them in an RCT, and then ultimately to share them around. We've done international work using the kernel's idea in collaboration with the International Rescue Committee and NYU, testing a small number of kernels in education in emergency in Lebanon and Niger. And that project is wrapped up, and we're learning about the effects of these kernels. But the idea is to build something that is a vehicle for scalability and for integration into settings that are non-traditional or traditional. That's it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. So perhaps we can go to Amanda and kind of give us a sense of your work through a bank.
Sure. Thanks, Sweta. Okay, great. So I lead the bank's global work on early childhood development, and I manage our trust fund, which is called the Early Learning Partnership, which is a $30 million trust fund. And it started in 2012, which is $2 million. And the initial idea was, at the time, the bank wasn't spending very much in early childhood development, and we didn't have a lot of traction with client countries. And the way World Bank finance is allocated is very much based on country demand. So if we meet with a Minister of Finance or a Minister of Education, and the minister says, we want our next project to be focused on early childhood, that's what happens. And then the bank works with the country to design the program, and then the government implements the program. So my role was actually very much an internal advocacy role and an external advocacy role. Because not only did I have to make sure that the bank teams and the bank management was equipped with the best arguments to work with clients and try and encourage them to decide to allocate money for early childhood, I also had to convince my own colleagues. And I work with economists and non-economists. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, what do we need to do to shift how bank financing is allocated? And some of it was very internal, very boring, very bureaucratic, thinking about the mechanisms and the country strategy processes and how you embed yourself. But some of it was also, okay, how do we make this case as effectively as we can? So we designed a model that focused on three ways of operating. The first was analytical work and research, which was basically our team thinking broadly about where are the evidence gaps, what information do we need, both in terms of how we communicate it and we can point to convince people to make these investments. The second was on country grants. So we designed a program where we made relatively large amounts of funding in the big picture. So it's about $10 million that's been available since 2012 for these country-level grants. But in each country, the grants range from about $50,000 to $200,000. And the idea was, if we made this funding available to bank teams and to country governments ahead of when they were preparing new projects or making big policy decisions, how could they use that money to make better decisions or to make the case that actually this next big chunk of money should be spent in early childhood? And so that model turned out to be far more successful than we ever expected. So our original funder was the Children's Investment Fund Foundation for this work. And they were really concerned about leverage. So they wanted to know, for every dollar you give us, what are you gonna return? And so with the initial $2 million, we generated $44 million of new investments in early childhood. And that was exciting, we're really happy about it, but then we kind of went back and thought, well, wait a minute, that's the first step, right? Are we sure these are good investments? Are they delivering actual shifts and outcomes for young children? And based on that, we refined our program again and thought about how we really engage with country governments and with bank teams. And the bank model is a bit hands-off. Like I said, the governments, we work with them in the design phase, but then the governments implement. But any of us working in low and middle-income countries in early childhood know that those ministries tend to have the least capacity, the least resources at their disposal. And so this model really wasn't going to work. And so we really staffed up our team, and we shifted the way the grants were available so that funds were available to stay with teams, not just in the project design phase, but throughout implementation. And that's made a huge shift, both in terms of convincing bank teams that they will have support throughout the process to develop quality interventions, and also governments to really respond to their demands. So based on that initial success, we then secured another $20 million from SIF and then another $7 million from DFID to focus on systems research. And so we've been operating with that budget for the last few years and into the future. And so far we've allocated $10 million of that funding, and that's generated more than $1 billion in new finance for early childhood. And I know those are, like I said, I work at the World Bank, I have to use the numbers, but let me give you a country example. So one I like to refer to is Cote d'Ivoire. There was a global partnership for education project being prepared in Cote d'Ivoire a few years ago, and the bank was the supervising entity for that. So we were working with the government to design the project, and then we would have sort of financial management responsibility for the project. And so at the time, I kind of knocked on my colleague's door and said, dude, I think there's a real opportunity here in Cote d'Ivoire. Have you seen the outcomes in early childhood? I know what you're trying to achieve in the education sector more broadly. I think if my team worked with you and with the government on shifting the investments in early childhood and really focusing on quality early learning opportunities, we could really make a change in the future. And what dude is, he's great and he's open, and not all my colleagues are. And he said, yeah, you should come on mission, talk to the government, see what they think, let's see. And the government was open, so we secured agreement to have $2 million of that project, so 10% to focus on early childhood. And then from there, one of my very best consultants, who is spectacular and very effective, and she worked with the government, but also with UNICEF very closely in country, and also with our impact evaluation colleagues at the bank, to think about how do we all in this space work together on a model for early childhood, looking at new ways to train teachers and new ways to work with the community. And that partnership at the country level was really powerful, to have not just the bank and UNICEF and different parts of the bank, but also all of the different parts of the government, because, as will not surprise you, there's a lot of different ministries and a lot of different departments within the ministries that are involved in early childhood in Cote d'Ivoire and in many countries, so we have to bring everyone around the same table. So that project keeps moving through preparation. When they get to the next phase of approval in preparing the project, it's so convincing that the $2 million is shifted to $5 million. So now we've got a fifth of the project on early childhood. And then 2 weeks before the final decision on the project, it got included to $8 million, because it was seen to be so well designed compared to the other things that had been in the project. So we went from having 10% of a project, just kind of like barely, to a third of the project. And I think that the stories there, the lessons learned there are around collaborating with the right partners in country, having really good quality people who spend time and work with the government and respond to the government's needs, but also understand the political economy of the system they're operating in, and how to make sure the incentives and the interests of everyone is aligned, because they are often not. Like in the early childhood space, we should all acknowledge that oftentimes different funders, different parts of the government, different civil society groups have very different interests. And so I'd like to tell that Cote d'Ivoire story. So anyways, we have 36 grants like that in different countries that are very much led by what the government and what the bank teams want to do. We've also had a lot of success looking at cash transfer programs or community health worker programs, and working with teams to integrate activities to promote early stimulation in those programs. But again, that's just a first step, right? Because we know from the evidence that those monthly meetings are not delivering the shifts in child outcomes we want. So the next phase is to really work with those teams to improve the programs. And then the third, so our first work area is analytical work, second is the country grants, the third area is capacity building. And this is something that we've really started focusing on in the last few years, thinking about, okay, what are our constraints at the country level? The bank was relying on the same international consultants. There weren't enough of those anyways, but they didn't have the local knowledge we needed in countries. The government ministries were there, but they were often under-resourced. So we launched a program called the Early Learning Fellowship, it's called the Early Years Fellowship, which recruited 20 young African professionals in their home countries to work for 2 years as fellows. So they work as World Bank's consultants for those 2 years on cross-sectoral early childhood programs. Many of them are sort of halfway seconded into the government, so they'll spend a few days a week working with the government. And their role is very much to help bank teams ensure that our investments are more coordinated in the early years space to actually deliver better outcomes for young children, but they allow us to extend our reach. So one example in Kenya, which I'm Keys Foundation has supported, is that the government came to us and said, could you support us in developing the early childhood policy, early childhood education? And that's something normally the bank would have to say no to because we don't have the bandwidth at the country level to work on that. But because we have these two fellows who have great expertise, could work with partners, they were able to work with the government and develop that policy. And a number of other great activities. So those fellows have been they've shifted the quality of the work and the relevance and of the work that's happening in country. But I also really genuinely believe we're building the next generation of leaders in early childhood because 25% of their time is dedicated to professional development. So they have writing courses, leadership development, peer-to-peer learning. They've been mentored by some of the greatest practitioners and researchers in the field. And they've done really just exceptional research and work together. And if I look back on almost 10 years at the bank, I think it's the best thing that probably I've done and ever will do. And they're amazing. So you should get to know them. Okay, so, and then on research topics, I think I've probably almost used my 10 minutes, so I won't go into telling you more about what we're doing on research. But maybe just to say a couple quick things. So one thing is I have really seen a genuine shift in government dialogue on early childhood. I started with the bank in 2010, and back then, if you were meeting with a minister, early childhood development would maybe come up at the end of the meeting, maybe. And now, it's in the top 3, if not the top, in most ministerial discussions in the education space and in health, nutrition, and social protection. I think based on the economic evidence, the brain science, people understand it's time to invest in early childhood. But then the question is how. And frankly, we don't have a good enough answer to the how. We don't have enough low-income countries that we can point to and say this country has demonstrably increased the scale and delivered on quality. We just don't. So if I were thinking of research goals for the field and implementation goals for the next 5 years, that's it. 5 years from now, can we point to a few countries, even just a few, where we could say the scale has really shifted and the quality is decent and children's outcomes are better. So then just a couple thoughts on what that means maybe for your research program. I think that the areas we're wrestling with and the areas where it would be great for you to think about our parent engagement, quality. We have some new work thinking about, which resonates a bit with what Stephanie was saying around children's natural motivation and potential to learn and how you design better quality preschool programs. And I very much agree with what Stephanie was saying about the fact that we talk about investments in early childhood, but mostly the policy response is preschool, and we know there's a disconnect there. I mean, I have plenty of people in my institution who say, don't talk to me about Jamaica anymore, because that's not what's happening. And we can't claim that we're going to get those kinds of returns. But what I will say is we looked at the PISA scores, which PISA is a test of adolescents' reading and math and other skills at age 15 in middle and higher income countries. And in 63 of those 65 countries that are participating in PISA in 2012, children who had attended early childhood education had statistically significant higher scores on reading and math as adolescents, when we controlled for everything possible we could control for. The difference in scores was biggest in lower income countries compared to higher income countries. And the difference in scores, so for the kids who had a year or less of preschool, they scored 40 points higher than kids who had no preschool. And the kids who had more than a year of preschool scored 80 points higher. And the standard deviation in PISA is 100 points, right? So that's almost a whole standard deviation. So this is population level stuff. We have no idea what the quality of the program those kids were in. There's a million reasons why this research is in no way a slam dunk, but there's something there. So I do think, preschool can certainly make the difference, but I absolutely agree that it's not the only thing, and we have to be thinking about the transition years. So that, I think, transition and what's happening after preschool is something really critical for you to think about. The workforce piece of the system, I think, is really important. And then the last point I'll make is, again, because I work at the bank, we talk a lot about system efficiency. That we have many countries where kids are repeating classes and it wastes money in the system. It's bad for the kids, it's bad for their families, they're not getting the outcomes they seek. But could you look at system efficiency, but from the perspective of the child. Like, what does that mean for the child when they are in the system that is so dysfunctional? Instead of looking at it from the system's perspective of repetition rates and scores, how do we follow a child through that system and sort of map the impacts at both levels? So I'll stop there, but thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, yeah, great. So a lot of rich ideas coming from both Amanda and Stephanie. So now I'll hand it over to Fiona for some thoughts from the LEGO Foundation.
Super, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm Fiona Smith. I set up the Early Learning Program at the LEGO Foundation. And for those of you that don't know the LEGO Foundation, we've got quite a focused mandate. So we look to enable children to be creative and engaged lifelong learners. So, I mean, the whole topic of this event, talking about uncertainty, really our mandate is really, talking to the world of uncertainty. How do you set up children so they learn how to learn? How do you set up children so that they can really thrive and be resilient in a world that we don't really know what will look like? Our main impact that we're looking to see within that is to develop children holistically. So for us, we think about whole child development really being around, of course, the cognitive, the physical, but social, emotional, and also creative for us is something that we're really interested in as well. And it's been great at this event that everyone's been speaking so much about social, emotional skills being so important, but we still face very, very often in the context that we work in South Asia and East Africa and Mexico, a push both from policymakers, from parents, from practitioners who, yes, they want children to develop well, but there's still a tension around maths and literacy at the earlier years. There's still a tension, and those are easy to measure. And I think we had debate in yesterday's session that the social emotional is more difficult. It's more investment to really think about that kind of development. So we're also really interested in what it takes to shift attitude and behaviours at the parental levels, and really thinking about the caregiver as being such an important part of a good ecological model. Thinking about how do we support practitioners and teachers. And then thinking about, how do you change systems? How do you really get policy to support this kind of, focus on developing children much more holistically? The way that we work, so I'll give you an example. So we look at building evidence and also trying to summarise what the evidence tells us and where are some of the evidence gaps. We invest in programs that can show quality from 0 to 12 and in different settings. And then we try to take that evidence and the programs and partners programs and being able to use that as a tool to work with others to think about how do you advocate, how do you get greater buy-in around this. If anybody who's familiar with LEGO Foundation, we talk a lot about learning through play. Learning through play for us is a how. It's a how children can develop this kind of holistic development. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the evidence that we've been working on. This year in particular, we've done quite a lot of work in trying to summarise what is some of the evidence, what do we know? Because at the foundation it was like, what do we know, what do we not know? And so there's been quite a few publications coming out that are all on our website. So we had a paper looking at what does the neuroscience tell us about learning through play, and a summary of what the current neuroscience, and there's some really interesting stuff there. We've been looking at the role of play in children's development, so looking at also the types of play. So, we've been talking a lot about, executive functioning, talking about social emotional development. There's some really good evidence out there that shows, games with rules, for example, is a great way to support executive functioning development. We know that pretend play, role play is a great way to develop, some social skills to be able to support children develop resilience as well. And Some other things that we're really interested in is what does learning through play look like in the first 1,000 days? That will be out later in this year. And another paper coming out this year is around play facilitation. So I think it was mentioned a little bit this morning during the OECD presentation. And we've been very interested in understanding the spectrum of free play and then directional play. What we know that's really challenging for practitioners is this bit in the middle, the guided play. How do you scaffold activities? How do you really go to where the child is and develop those skills? And so the paper's really providing some evidence on what we know, what types of play build which skills, and also some thoughts around how you can support practitioners. We know in our own work, across the spectrum, like mainly teachers and practitioners in the early years, it's a new way for them to teach, to facilitate, and it's really tough, that middle part. So we're super interested in how do you develop workforce. And then we've also been looking with Harvard Centre on the Developing Child, looking at the role of play to support coping and resilience, and particularly to toxic stress. Like how can play really support children who are in that extremely stressful situations. In terms of then on the programmatic side, I'll give you a quick example. So one model that we've been co-creating with BRAC in Bangladesh, Uganda and Tanzania is a model called a Play Lab model. And so this is a informal, community-based, community-run early learning model for 3 to 5 year old children. It's really supposed to be quite holistic in terms of supporting parents to come into the centres, asking parents to take part in toy-making sessions, and using that as a vehicle to not only have that parent-to-parent engagement, but also use that as a vehicle to support them to think about how they can engage more playfully at home as well. The play facilitators are mainly young women from the community, and we're really interested, like yourself, around that workforce, development piece, and particularly, this is really low-income settings. We're interested in how can you really get quality at a really low-income, low-resource setting, and BRAC have done an amazing amount of work within communities that are very low resource, and this is really trying to think through how can we create quality experiences for young children there. With the Play Labs, we are doing research with University of Cambridge, Columbia University and BRAC University, and what we've found as a gap in the evidence is really understanding, in quite different cultural contexts. So we got Bangladesh, Uganda, Tanzania. How are children developing executive functioning? How are they developing other forms of social and emotional? And looking at those, quite a lot of work being done, looking at what are good indicators to use in those settings. So we're looking at those children, and those results will come out in 2020. And then I think on the final part then, it's linking up the practice and the evidence to then work with others to think about how can you work with policy change, and recognising as well that I think for the early years there's a number of different models, similar to what Stephanie was saying, that there's not one, it's across the board. So then, in terms of some gaps in research and what we're really interested in seeing, I think very much aligned with what you said, Amanda, in terms of looking at parent engagement, the quality, the design. Like, what are some of these factors that really create good impact on children's development? We're really interested in understanding, particularly learning through play being a vehicle, particularly in the early years, how it's providing that holistic skills development, and really where I see a real lack of research is in different cultural contexts. So the fact that you're going to be working across so many countries and being able to look at some of the factors that might work, in a country in Bangladesh versus, South Africa, and trying to be able to unpick it, it's going to be so rich. There's such a lack of good evidence there. And the other part particularly interested in is, this question of transition. So if, skills and children are being developed in the early years, how are those skills serving children once they transition into school? Does it translate into them doing better at school, both in terms of academics, but also, more broadly? Are they a good participant in the classroom? Are they able to make friends? Are they able to, communicate? So really keeping that breadth of skills angle on it as well. And then for us as well, really thinking about, to your point, what are the effective ECD services at scale? How do they kind of integrate and align with different forms of delivery within the government?
Great, thank you so much. So I have myself like a trillion questions, but given that we don't have tons of time, I actually would like to open it up to all of you if you have some comments, some questions for any of our speakers.